Tonight, remember this? A pact that ended the electoral career of the DUP's Westminster leader back in 2020. Could 2024 bring similar bad fortune to the party? We'll assess how political partnerships and boundary changes will influence our next intake of MPs. And as the toxic debate over immigration in the Republic continues, we'll ask if it could become a defining issue in Dáil politics. Hello, last year it was the Assembly, this year it was the Councils, and sooner than you think, maybe it'll be Westminster's turn. Rest assured the parties are already making preparations, and for some that could mean working together. Pacts have long been a feature of general elections here, and the next one's likely to be no different. Our studio panel is prepped and ready to discuss the ground game. But first, our political reporter Brendan Hughes takes a look at the key constituency clashes and areas for potential cooperation.
The next Westminster election could be a year away, but battle lines are already being drawn. And in Northern Ireland, that means talk is turning to one thing: pacts. Are they worth it? Will there be any? And if so, what impact may they have on who's elected? There's no question the campaign for Westminster is spicing up after this exchange between the DUP and Alliance.
And do you know what? Our job is to govern, our job is to stand for election and do a job. So do you know what? If you don't want to do the job, get out of the way and let those of us who want to govern. Jeffrey, I'll come back to you. I promise I'll come back to you.
Saoirse can look down her nose at unionists all she wants, but I got a mandate from the people of this constituency to take the actions that I have taken.
Jeffrey Donaldson has been MP for Lagan Valley for 26 years, but Saoirse Eastwood ran him close in 2019. And after this debate, Alliance has been talking up her chances.
Jeffrey Donaldson, 18,199.
Former Sinn Féin MLA Paul Butler has experience of challenging the DUP for the Lagan Valley seat, but he thinks Sinn Féin and the SDLP should step aside for Saoirse Eastwood.
There's no seat there for nationalists. Saoirse Eastwood, I think, potentially could get all those votes. People who would normally vote for Sinn Féin and the SDLP would vote for Saoirse Eastwood. So it leaves it very doable for the Alliance to win that seat.
In electoral pacts here, it's usually unionists v nationalists, and Brexit was another fault line in the last Westminster poll. But Paul Butler says this time Sir Geoffrey's Stormont boycott could be the driver of tactical voting.
If we come the next election and there's no Assembly, still going on about the Windsor framework, about an Irish sea border, and that's why we're staying out of the institutions. I think the electorate are weary of it. That's my prediction. And I think he's in trouble if that's the case.
Polarising to some, pacts can inflame passions. When a unionist deal defeated Alliance leader Naomi Long in East Belfast, the winner, Gavin Robinson, didn't hold back.
I'm delighted that the last 5 long years are over.
Nowhere has the contest been closer than in Fermanagh, South Tyrone. The seat has flipped between Sinn Féin and the UUP ever since the DUP stepped aside in 2015. The Ulster Unionists will face pressure to do another quid pro quo with the DUP, particularly in North Belfast, where Nigel Dodds was ousted last time by Sinn Féin's John Finucane. UUP leader Doug Beattie has been against pacts in the past, but will he have a change of heart? The party's former North Belfast candidate says she'll quit if there's a pact, but she argues it's not a pact if the party can't find the money to run a candidate.
I haven't been a candidate before, trying to find that money, to pay for those little odds and ends. It all adds up. The last election campaign cost $4,500. And it was a huge gamble to have nothing for it at the very end. And so it leaves without options. If the party are able to trump up the money, I'm here, let's go.
Over in South Belfast, the SDLP won back the seat from the DUP. Its campaign was helped by Sinn Féin stepping aside, with the SDLP giving Sinn Féin a free run in North Belfast.
But the big moment came from the Green Party. In an anti-Brexit coalition, Claire Bailey backed the SDLP's Claire Hanna, giving her campaign the edge. But look what's happened to the Green Party since then. They've lost both their Assembly seats in South Belfast and here in North Down.
This former Green Party leader says the pact was a mistake.
For me, the election results bore it out. Previous election results where other parties have stepped aside bear it out. You step aside, you miss a whole election campaigning for your candidate, getting your name out there, convincing the voters that you're the party of choice. You opt out of that and your vote will take a hit.
The Alliance Party's deputy leader was the surprise winner of 2019, claiming the North Down seat, which many thought was the DUP's to lose after independent unionist Sylvia Herman stepped down. Alliance opposes pacts, but could Stephen Farry face a unionist alliance at the polls?
It's definitely a possibility. I'm sure people are having that conversation. Pacts always come up around North Down. But I think an assumption that a single unionist candidate, for example, will automatically be successful. Again, I think elections disprove that. People, when they're denied choice, sometimes stay at home.
And there's another factor in the mix. It's out with the old and in with the new as constituency boundaries are redrawn. What impact could that have on the election?
The most eye-catching changes really are in the likes of South Belfast, for example. It's the only constituency where the name has changed, where it'll now be South Belfast and Mid Down, taking in Saintfield. But in many ways, South Belfast anyway is quite a competitive seat.
Since the last Westminster election, we've had the Northern Ireland Protocol and COVID, so a lot has happened in 4 years. Some things are the same. For one, Stormont is down again, but will it be for much longer? Throw in boundary changes and a few pacts, and we have the makings of an unpredictable contest.
Brendan Hughes reporting. Let's interrogate the issue further with three experts who know where the battle lines are likely to be drawn. Chris Donnelly is a political commentator who once stood for Sinn Féin. David Ford is a former Justice Minister and former leader of the Alliance Party. And Lee Reynolds is a former DUP Special Advisor. Welcome to the programme. Thank you for joining us. Lee Reynolds, generally speaking, do you think pacts work?
They can, but just simply having one isn't enough. You can't just get a bunch of parties together, picking a candidate and then just walking away. It has to be the right candidate for the constituency, and the parties who have stood aside on us actually have to campaign for the person as well. So just saying we've got a single candidate, go on your merry way, is not the guarantee for success.
Yeah, because David Ford, Alliance generally doesn't like pacts, and a lot of voters don't like them either.
No, I think one interesting thing in that package was the reference to tactical voting, which is very different from pacts. Pacts are an attempt to restrict choice and stop people being on the ballot. Tactical voting is when electors decide who they think, if not necessarily their first choice, is their second or third choice, who can beat the person they most want to see go out. Look what's been happening in England in by-elections in recent months. There's clearly an anti-Conservative majority. Virtually every constituency, electors work out whether it's Labour or the Liberal Democrats who are the challenger and tactically vote. But there are always candidates from both parties on the ballot paper.
Yeah, although sometimes it's a little bit more complicated here in Northern Ireland for reasons that we don't need to go into, but that we all know very well.
Accepting that, but the margins between parties in Northern Ireland are perhaps not always as big as people historically suggest.
Yeah, nationalists have a bit of a love-hate relationship with pacts, really, don't they? Maybe more about tacit understandings, tacit agreements these days?
Yeah, I think for a long time it was viewed, Mark, more as something that the unionist parties were involved with, and therefore it was something that nationalists thought, well, we shouldn't go for pacts. It maybe for some of the arguments that David said. I think that changed profoundly in the last election. And what I think is that I think both David and Lee made a good point around the tactical voting. But what I think happened when it works the best is where people who want to vote tactically feel that they've given the licence to. If their party withdraws, then they're full in on that. I don't think, where I would argue with Lee is I would say that parties find it very difficult to go out and canvass for representatives of different political parties. I don't think in our society they've necessarily needed to. If there's a big picture narrative out there, like it was the last election around Brexit, or potentially, as Paul Butler alluded to in that, if our institutions are still down at the next election, the big picture story writes itself and people will take a position on that and vote accordingly.
Because I think what some voters in particular hate is being taken for granted.
Yes, they hate being taken for granted, but if there is a big picture story. It's binary choice is invariably what happens when it comes to PACs. We saw certainly in the last election, that did not in any way inhibit turnout. In fact, turnout was up in those constituencies.
Yeah, and it can come down to least worst option for some people, of course.
It can, but it's all about, the important thing is narrative. You know, it's basically, this is partially what happened with Gavin whenever there was a pact in East Belfast in the election, his first election. There was a loss of control of the narrative. Alliance succeeded in gaining more of the narrative of this is about denial of choice. So if unionism's going for PACs, it has to not do it from a position of a crouch, but as a positive narrative.
What's the narrative? Campaigning well on the doorsteps? Is that what you mean by a narrative?
My narrative of basically, this is the bigger thing that's going to flow from you voting in the way that we're asking you to. That this is the bigger positive story. The opportunity for unionism in this is getting unionism winning again. That if you want to take the seals out of Sinn Féin Ireland Future's PSYOPs operation, that there's some great wave for Irish unity, then the Westminster election is a perfect opportunity for unionism to do that.
So that's zero-sum politics, actually, isn't it?
No, it's about getting a positive narrative about Northern Ireland again. That's what it's about.
It depends whether you see something like that as positive, of course, because, David, not everybody would obviously not everybody would necessarily see that kind of narrative as a positive narrative.
And it's profoundly negative in seeking to restrict choice. If the narrative is we're all one big happy family in unionism, then why don't they form one party? They're clearly not all agreed. The suggestion that's coming up in places like North Down that you can somehow go everywhere from the sort of unionists who used to vote for Sylvia Herman to the TUV and Alex Easton, and that they will all be happy to vote for one candidate, is clearly not a representation of the variety of views that exist there.
Yeah, although the whole debate about unionist unity is slightly off the boil at the moment, isn't it?
Well, in answer to David's point, that shapes who you have to select as a candidate. You have to pick the one with the broadest appeal. Just doesn't necessarily happen to be the person that's biggest party, and the one they want doesn't necessarily should be.
Which could again be the least worst option.
Perhaps not. But look, you know my position. I have been an advocate previously for that unionism should create a Westminster Unionist Party, follow the Quebec model, that we have one single Unionist Party advocating for Northern Ireland in the National Parliament, and we have a variety of unionism offering its different visions for the devolved assembly in Northern Ireland. Yeah. Now,
it's maybe a great idea, but in all honesty, you couldn't get all of the unionists who you'd want to be in that party to agree who would lead that party, who the candidates would be, what it would be called.
What their policies would be at Westminster.
Yeah, but I mean that's a slightly separate conversation, of course, to PACs. I suppose what I wanted to ask you, just before we move on to talk about some of the constituencies in detail, is this going to be actually, at the end of the day, this next election, whenever it happens, 18 separate elections with their own unique challenges and circumstances, do you think, David?
Well, there are always individual challenges in different constituencies, but particularly at a Westminster general election, things tend to get covered in a much broader brush. We're not talking about the micro-politics of a single DEA for a council. So I think that it's hard to say that there are 18 completely different contests.
Do you think it comes down to 18 separate elections?
No, I don't. I think if we look over
so there's a common thread?
Oh, there most certainly is. There's been a common thread through the Assembly election, which we had, the local government election earlier this year. I mean, people weren't voting in all of the different DEAs on just simply local themes. What was driving particularly nationalists out was the big picture story at the moment that people believe that the DUP, one of the reasons that they don't want to go back to government is because they don't want to serve alongside a Sinn Féin First Minister. And that is something that plays massively within nationalism. And if that is not addressed prior to the next Westminster election, then most assuredly that's going to be a factor across those 18 constituencies.
But if you take unionism, I mean, the battles in places like Fermanagh and South Tyrone, East Londonderry, East Belfast, South Belfast, they're all quite different. They're all quite distinct.
I follow Lyndon Baines Johnson philosophy for elections. If you want to win, you have to do everything. There will be national, bigger, broader pictures that are affecting it, but there'll be local things that you're trying to play the edge, you're trying to play the percentages, and that can make the difference in a marginal seat.
OK, let's talk about some of the constituencies in particular, and we have to keep reminding ourselves that we're talking specifically about pacts here, because it's easy to stray into other issues because there's so much of interest to talk about. In Lagan Valley, is Sir Geoffrey Donaldson potentially in trouble?
No.
Are you sure about that?
Right.
Because an awful lot of people think he is.
A lot of people wish to think he is. And that's slightly different.
You think it's wishful thinking?
Right. Look at the last election. It was a 60% unionist constituency with 40% going to others. From 2019 to 2022, the Alliance physical vote and percentage vote in Lagan Valley was down. The party that actually grew in Lagan Valley from 2019 to 2022 was the Ulster Unionist Party. It's also seemed to be forgotten, as everybody chases after Saoirse Eastwood, that actually Robbie Butler outpolled her at the Assembly election. So there are a lot of factors in hard numbers that people seem to wish to ignore when it comes to Lagan Valley.
Well, it's there are differences, and we need to make this point, of course, as well. Just point out to people there are two different electoral systems, and there are multiple candidates returned in an Assembly election as opposed to one candidate returned in a Westminster election. I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but it is just worth reminding people that we're not comparing like with like. There's an awful lot of talk, fighting talk from Alliance as far as taking Jeffrey Donaldson's seat is concerned in Lagan Valley next time round. But Lee Reynolds says it's no chance.
Well, I didn't bring my Lagan Valley crib sheet with me, but
it's all in your head, David.
To say about the votes between Saoirse and Robbie Butler completely ignores the fact that Alliance also elected David Honeyford. We got a second MLA for the first time ever in Lagan Valley. So that's part of the narrative which needs to be taken into account. Clearly, and the fact that the national BBC programme highlighting Saoirse turning Jeffrey Donaldson's words back on himself is clearly turning it into a very interesting contest. I don't sit here and say Saoirse is going to win, but she certainly has set down a marker, and that's where I think...
Yeah, but Lee says it's wishful thinking, that's the point.
Well, he would, wouldn't he? And I would say the other way. But what I think is clearly the case is what Paul Butler said when he talked about tactical voting, not the issue of a pact, because there will be no pacts from Alliance unless things have changed drastically in the last 12 hours. There will be no pacts from Alliance, but if people who would otherwise vote for other parties but think quite correctly that the contest is between Jeffrey Donaldson and Saoirse Eastwood, they may choose to vote for Saoirse, and we will obviously welcome their votes.
What do you think will happen as far as nationalism is concerned in Lagan Valley? I mean, on the one hand, there may be a temptation for nationalists to stand back altogether or to put up paper candidates, but wouldn't nationalist parties be thinking about building support for the next Assembly election?
I think that would be a very considerable factor in Lagan Valley. For a period of years, and I know the story in Lagan Valley quite well. I worked alongside Paul Butler there a long time ago when he was elected as MLA there. The boundary changes after that then removed the potential really for nationalists to get elected. Pat Catney got elected after that. Yeah. What we're seeing in these new boundary changes are I think it's become 2% more Catholic. Now that in that environment where we've also had a local government election where both Sinn Féin and the SDLP got elected in North Lisburn, where they came quite close to getting one of the two candidates from the parties elected in South Lisburn. Those parties, I think, would be looking to say, hold on, if we stepped aside, we might, lose an opportunity to at least profile a candidate. Now, put alongside that, yes, it might be in their interest to say, well, hold on, we like the idea of the DUP leader facing a challenge in his backyard.
Wouldn't that make Saoirse Eastwood a de facto nationalist candidate if nationalists stood back in that way? Whether Alliance would like that or not, that's how unionists would interpret it.
It might be, and it might be the case that they do. But
so it could backfire.
It could, but from their perspective, they could perhaps run candidates with low profiles, which achieves the same objective, perhaps.
Okay, David.
So if Saoirse Eastwood stands on an Alliance platform, and some people who are traditionally nationalists vote for her, that makes her a nationalist.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm asking the question.
But
wouldn't some unionists see her as a nationalist candidate in that situation?
Vote Ulster unionists decide that Saoirse is a better option for an MP than Jeffrey Donaldson? Does that make her a unionist? She's an Alliance candidate. People may choose to vote for whatever reasons they choose. It doesn't actually alter the party that she represents.
Yeah, of course, you're absolutely right about that, but it is about perception. Isn't politics always about perception? Let's talk about North Down.
Let's have a bit of reality and not just perception.
OK, sure. Talk about North Down. What's the reality of North Down? Because if you look at the numbers and there is an agreed unionist candidate, Stephen Farry, the sitting Alliance MP, would be in trouble.
Assuming that everybody who votes for the Ulster Unionist Party, for Alex Easton, for the DUP, the TUV, can find somebody who represents their ideals and they can all vote for them, then yes, that would be the case.
Yeah.
But that is making a huge assumption that all unionists are the same.
Well, it's making an
what we
assumption.
haven't seen is Lee's...
It's timely that we're having this conversation because the front page of today's County Down Spectator reports that talks are underway about the possibility of running a single unionist candidate. And the paper says those high-level discussions between the DUP, the UUP, the TUV and the Orange Order, with Alex Easton believed to be the front runner, are currently happening, even though Doug Beattie said the Ulster Unionists aren't part of that process.
So Alex Easton, who left the DUP but who has sided with the DUP in opposing the election of a Speaker in the Assembly, who's done nothing to suggest he's in any way different, is somehow attractive to Ulster Unionist voters?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if he's the sole Unionist candidate, maybe in that situation he would be. What do you think's happening in North Down? Do these reports of talks about an agreed candidate
There's a degree of
ring
hypocrisy
true?
here of Alliance going, no pacts, no pacts. Stephen Parry was elected in a de facto pact.
No.
All the other parties basically pulled out who were nationalist or others in North Down. If you looked at the council vote prior to that Westminster election, essentially everybody who had voted for Alliance, Greens, others, Independents and nationalists voted for him.
So you see very little difference between a pact and an understanding or a tacit agreement?
If
it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck.
Weakness is not treachery, but it fulfills all its functions. An unofficial pact or an official
pact.
pact.
That's the upmarket version of if it walks like a duck. OK.
What's an unofficial pact?
Yes, ducks quack, they don't talk. I'm being
reminded. What's an unofficial pact?
The other parties pulling out and encouraging their voters to vote for another party.
That's a tactical decision by other parties. There was no alliance.
Does Alliance approve of that, or do you just quietly look the other way?
Well, then,
I made it quite clear that Alliance is looking for people to choose to vote tactically for Alliance if they think Alliance is the best option in their constituency.
Yeah,
that's not a pact.
There is a difference, and the difference is this, and the danger of pacts is really what has happened to political unionism, where parties come together. And what we're saying in that local newspaper report today is, and David made the point, it didn't just say the TUV, the DUP, UUP, it also said the Orange Order. So if you're trying to get a candidate, and that's the people you're bringing together, then invariably there are people within maybe that broad pro-union community who will be uncomfortable with that whole narrative, that whole picture. And that is one of the reasons that Alliance have benefited. The whole reason why, in an extraordinary sense, that an overwhelmingly unionist constituency like North Down might need a packed unionist candidate to get the seat back for unionism is because of the positioning that unionism finds itself in today.
OK, I should say Stephen Farry's confirmed on Twitter tonight that his intention is to run again for Alliance in North Down. He says it's the voters who'll decide who wins, not those, as he puts it, in smoke-filled rooms. Not sure that smoke-filled rooms are still a thing, but I think we know what he's talking about. We're all long enough in the tooth to understand the reference. South Belfast is an interesting one. And again, Claire Hanna is there, and there is talk about what might happen if Alliance were to run someone like Kate Nicholl, former Lord Mayor, of course, currently an MLA. How do you think that'll shake down next time round, David?
Well, I'm not an expert in South Belfast, but it's clear that that is one of the constituencies which has had the biggest change. The very fact, as was highlighted, it's no longer South Belfast, it's South Belfast and Mid-Down.
Yeah.
Does make a difference. My understanding, adding up the figures from the council election, is Alliance is the biggest party in the new constituency. There is, however, the issue of incumbency. But clearly, when people have voted at the constituency level in the old constituency for 2 Alliance MLAs and only 1 for the SDLP, when they've elected more Alliance councillors than SDLP councillors, the incumbency factor starts to lose out to the activity on the ground factor.
Here's my question. Do you think Alliance will go full tilt at winning that seat? The danger being, from an Alliance perspective, maybe, that the current incumbent, Claire Hanna, loses out to a unionist, or will Alliance put up what we might view as a paper candidate?
I'm happy to say I'm no longer in the leadership group. I will not be taking those decisions as to how we target.
Well, OK, but I'm asking you, what should Alliance do in that situation?
What Alliance should do is campaign for the maximum Alliance vote
try to win the seat
in every constituency.
Try to win the seat.
And that means trying to win the seats where it's possible.
What's your reading of South Belfast? A fascinating one, isn't it?
Claire Hanna is in real trouble. If I was Sinn Féin sitting in Connolly House, I would think I've got a perfect opportunity for a decapitation strategy against the SDLP. What has come into
assuming, of course, that Sinn Féin would want Claire Hanna ultimately not to be in Westminster, but potentially back in the Assembly, and Sinn Féin might not want Claire Hanna back in the Assembly?
Sinn Féin are much more brutal in my experience than that. They would prefer, I think, just to completely decapitate the SDLP.
In the hope that Sinn Féin could actually win that seat, because Deirdre Hargey, of course, did very well last time.
The Sinn Féin outpolled in the old boundaries. Sinn Féin outpolled the SDLP. The new boundaries are probably more beneficial for unionism and alliance in terms of what's coming in. So that increases unionism's chances. It also increases alliance's chances.
Yeah, Deirdre Hargey won 21% in the last Assembly poll. That's what I was referring to there. Of course, the party has stood aside in the past. What's your reading of South Belfast?
I would disagree with Lee. I don't think it's in Sinn Féin's interest to gift this seat out of the hands of Claire Hanna, potentially back to a unionist, as happened before. And of course, this is the trajectory Alistair MacDonald went on. The SDLP were going down. They narrowly won it, and then they lost it to Emma Pengelly that time. So I think it's more likely that it strengthens Sinn Féin's hands to look for another deal in terms of North Belfast and South Belfast from the SDLP, knowing that really with the boundary changes, John Finucane's actually a little bit stronger. And we know that Claire Hanna is actually in a weaker position.
Do you think it has to be John Finucane next time round, or do you think they'll try to bring Sinn Féin will try to bring John Finucane back to the Assembly and put some other candidate in there in the belief that that seat is maybe now a safe Sinn Féin seat? Is it?
I think the seat is too precarious to take John.
Not safe
it's
yet.
Their call, obviously,
Yeah.
but I think that John Finucane was the right candidate to win that seat, and pulling him out could be a dangerous
Can the
strategy.
DUP get that seat back?
There's a Finucane factor there. If the candidate's John Finucane, it's still potentially winnable if there are a number of other parties in the race. Okay. But it certainly becomes even more interesting if he isn't.
I just want to ask you very quickly and finally about this letter from the NIO today inviting the 5 main parties to talks at Hillsborough on Monday to discuss apparently public finances. Are we, David, in your view, perhaps seeing a deal approaching?
That's certainly hard to tell, given that the only party that's really been involved in any significant discussions with the government has been the DUP. But there has to be an end to that ongoing, endless discussion. And what we need to see is realistic plans for finances for the future.
OK, in a sentence?
I don't know. I think the DUP are gaslighting us all.
None of us know, but what's your hunch?
I don't
Does it suggest we're moving towards something substantial?
We might be inching forward, but it doesn't look like we're at that decisive moment yet.
OK.
I don't.
Anything to tell us?
Well, I can commend the DUP negotiating team, because for all my best efforts over the past few months, I've not managed to get anything out of any of them.
They're not telling you either?
They're not telling me either. But it's broadly this, because there's 2 problems to solve. The money side for restoration of the executive is one of those 2 problems.
Yep.
But the fact that the parties are working on one, I wouldn't necessarily automatically read that problem number 1 has been solved.
OK, so we're in the final stages, maybe. Or maybe there's another final stage still to
Extra
come.
time.
We need to leave it there, folks. Really interesting conversation. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us. Let's turn our attention now to politics in the Republic and the growing debate over the state's migration policy. With local and European elections coming up in 6 months, will those who are disillusioned with the government use that as a chance to vent their frustration? And if so, who'd be best placed to capitalise on it? Polling at the weekend suggested Sinn Féin's high ratings are falling back, and some have wondered aloud if the party's motion of no confidence in the Justice Minister Helen McEntee has backfired. Let's try and answer some of those questions now with Gavin Riley, political correspondent at Virgin Media News, and Kevin Cunningham, who's a pollster from Ireland Thinks. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. Gavin, the Dáil debated migration earlier this week and passed a motion emphasising the importance of inward migration. What did you make of the contributions?
I thought one thing that was really interesting about that whole debate, Mark, was that it was triggered by the Rural Independent group of TDs, a technical group of independents who notionally aren't from the same political orientation, but in practice are all of the same political viewpoint. Okay. And that they were very sole voices in all of this, that they were the only ones that were raising any real criticism as to Ireland's current policy. They thought as an open doors policy that means that those not from the country are getting more than their fair share of public resources. I thought it was very telling that there wasn't very much support for that view echoed anywhere else within. And in fact, when the Dáil passed that motion commending the current more lax approach to inward migration and commending the economic necessity for all of that, there were only 7 TDs MPs that were actually opposed to that, 6 of them from the Rural Independent Group, and Peadar Tabine of Aintu being the other one. So it was quite striking that in a weird way, although it was kind of framed in perhaps an anti-immigrant tone, because it was ultimately as a result of a motion that was brought by that independent technical group, that ultimately the outcome, as you might see it on paper, was quite an affirmative one in terms of the current stance.
So, I mean, as we know, the Republic doesn't, as things stand, have any far-right anti-immigration parties of now, but that's where that voice is coming from within the political conversation at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's what's quite interesting then as we move towards a general election and we get to the question of who might actually gain from there being a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, if you look at elsewhere in Europe, and I'm sure Kevin will be better able to advise on this in a moment, but if you look at anywhere else across Europe, generally the view of anti-immigrant sentiment tends to coordinate quite a lot with nationalism in those countries. But as we know, of course, in Ireland, nationalism means something else entirely. Not alone that, but also because we have such a concentration of independent TDs in the Dáil, and because they generally tend to refer to specific constituency interests, it's almost like in the Republic that idea of nationalism has been bypassed, because you're not just thinking about the integrity of your country, you're thinking about the integrity of your community. So you tend, therefore, to elect independents who are very clientelist and who are very specific about their orientation towards local areas. So whether there is the scope for that to scale up in the next general election remains to be seen. One interesting question, I think, really will be whether the general election comes before the locals or vice versa, because in a local election, you might well have a situation where quite a number of people get elected on specifically local tickets of opposing asylum seeker or international protection accommodation in their area, and that then might snowball into a seat in Dáil Éireann, where the general election to follow not long after.
Well, it's a fascinating conversation. I mean, Kevin, your polling has found that the anti-immigration view has increased among supporters across almost every party. Is there, in your view, the space for an anti-immigration party itself in Irish politics? Is there a gap in the market?
Well, I think, just to reiterate, to be honest, what Gavin said, I think there is a gap ideologically in the market in terms of as Rory Costello has done some very interesting work in the past to identify a very specific gap in relation to the relative conservative positions in Irish politics. But I think a lot of it is captured by independent candidates, exactly as Gavin has said, and our opinion polling shows that out exactly. I mean, 55% of those that currently support independent candidates also state that they would consider a party or a candidate that would have kind of anti-immigration views. So it's very much within that independent vote. And I think it isn't coincidental, the fact that the Republic of Ireland has, as Gavin said, a very large number of independent candidates that get elected. And it also is pretty much unique, apart from Lithuania, I think, at this stage, in terms of the fact that there isn't an active far-right political party. The other thing to consider is also the STV system, which will invariably make it more difficult for a political party that is solely focused on an anti-immigration perspective, because as you saw there, in terms of the vote in the Dáil, all the parties are on one side, and you have this minority of political parties on the other, the minority of independent candidates on the other. So their ability to attract preferences from other candidates might be actually quite limited in and of itself as well. I think... Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to ask you where you think all of this leaves Sinn Féin, because I think your most recent poll suggests that 36%, correct me if I'm wrong, of Sinn Féin voters would consider voting instead in future for an anti-immigration party.
Yeah, that's true. It's important not to misinterpret some of this, because it is true that Sinn Féin's vote is also quite working class, and there's a little bit more working class vote in terms of in this area. But it's also worth identifying the fact that Sinn Féin voters are actually more likely to care about other issues. So when you look at the percentages that actually care about immigration as an issue, Sinn Féin voters are no more likely than Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil voters in terms of the extent to which they care about immigration. That's because the Sinn Féin vote itself seems to be captured very specifically about issues like the cost of living and housing in particular. And you can see why Sinn Féin deputies are trying to re-elevate the salience of those issues, because when those issues are very, very prominent, that party does particularly well. And I think, some parties might use an adoption strategy. You might expect Sinn Féin to might go a little bit more conservative on this issue. But broadly, I think what we should expect is Sinn Féin to actually try to raise up the salience of other issues in particular.
Yeah. Gavin, it's fascinating as far as what the implications of this might be for Sinn Féin. I mean, we don't know. These are uncharted waters. But do you think there is a possibility that if this plays out the wrong way for Sinn Féin, it could scupper the party's chances of getting into government?
I think Sinn Féin is coming from a very healthy starting point going into this debate, escalating a little bit at the start of the polls before Kevin's poll of the weekend for the Sunday Independent and one previously. Their lead over Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael was routinely in double digits. So to some degree, there is a lead that they can almost afford to have whittled away to a point before it really becomes electorally damaging. One thing which I did think was fascinating about those two opinion polls across the last 2 weekends is that not alone in both instances was Sinn Féin losing a couple of points going from the low 30s to the high 20s, but also that the real beneficiaries of that loss of Sinn Féin support seem to be falling into the independents or others category, this kind of undefined idea where people were either voting for independent candidates, maybe like the ones like the rural independents that we mentioned a moment ago, or maybe they're considering some of the other fringe parties on the wings of Ireland's political spectrum. There's parties like the National Party, the Irish People Party only recently registered. There's the Irish Freedom Party, which explicitly wants Ireland to follow the Brexit route. They're promoting Irexit. It'll be interesting to see whether in future polls there is a continuation of that kind of trend and whether the slow support that might be shedded by Sinn Féin as a result of all of this is actually moving in that direction. Of course, one other possibility about Sinn Féin shedding support is that it might be because Sinn Féin is seen perhaps to have over-politicised some of the events that we've seen in Dublin, the rioting 2 weeks ago this evening, and maybe some of the support that they've lost is a critique from the electorate who think that they might have jumped the gun by moving that motion of no confidence in Helen McEntee quite as quickly as they did.
We don't have a lot of time here, but Kevin, I wanted to ask you about one person who's making his voice heard on this issue, and that is, of course, Conor McGregor. Polls suggest, of course, he hasn't got a chance of winning the presidency, but the very fact that people are now talking about that, even if they're half serious about it, is interesting, isn't it? What do you make of all that speculation?
I don't know. I can't see. I mean, I've actually done some opinion polls on Conor McGregor in the past, and it's been interesting how his popularity in Ireland has declined quite substantially over time. And I think, generally speaking, attitudes towards Conor McGregor in particular have solidified over a number of years, and the extent to which he could reverse it in the same way in which other sort of otherwise very unpopular figures, if you remember in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro was a very, very unpopular man a long time before he actually became president. I don't see that sort of thing happening really in Ireland, and that's probably because people's views, at least for the immediate horizon on Conor McGregor, are still relatively poor. It's worth bearing in mind that Irish attitudes on these issues are still relatively far more progressive than those of our other European countries. 61% in our latest poll showed that people thought that immigration was enriching culture. Now,
I just want to give a final word to Gavin. We've got 20 seconds. Gavin, President Conor McGregor, does it have a ring to it?
I can tell you that tomorrow's front page of the Irish edition of The Sun has done a survey of every member of the Oireachtas who would have the power to nominate him, to get him onto the ballot. Not a single one of the Oireachtas members canvassed by The Sun said that they would consider giving him a nomination. One person said that they wouldn't trust him to wash the dishes. Make of that what you will.
Well, interesting point to end on. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. That's all we've got time for tonight. This programme will be available on iPlayer shortly. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics at 10 o'clock on BBC One. Do join me for that. For now, though, from everybody in the programme, thanks for watching. Night night.